Welcome to Utilizing AI, the podcast about enterprise applications for machine learning, deep learning, and other artificial intelligence topics. Each episode brings experts in enterprise infrastructure and artificial intelligence together to discuss applications of AI in today's data center. Today we're discussing Kubeflow, but first let's meet our guests.
Hi, my name is David Aponte, and I'm a machine learning engineer. You could find me on LinkedIn at David Aponte, and you could also reach out to me via the MLOps community.
Hello, what's up, everyone? I am Demetrios Brinkmann, and I am the MLOps community organizer. The best way to get in touch with me is through the MLOps community Slack channel.
I'm Stephen Foskett, organizer of Tech Field Day and publisher of Gestalt IT, including the AI Field Day that's upcoming. You can find me on Twitter at @sfoskett, and you can find my writing at gestaltit.com. And now let's meet our co-host, Andy Thurai.
Hi, I'm Andy Thurai, founder and principal at thefieldcto.com. You can follow me at Andy Thurai or thefieldcto.com.
So we were just discussing something over at the fantastic MLOps community that you run, Demetrios. Over there, there's a questions and answers thread that's 50 answers long now about Kubeflow. And basically the question is, is this thing the real deal? Is this truly, the future? Is this open source project going to rule them all? Or is it kind of petering out? There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of things that come into that, a lot of baggage with that. So maybe you can introduce it just quickly and just tell us what's up with the thread, and then we can kind of get into the question.
Yeah, so I think that there has been some talk around Kubeflow and where it's going, and if it is dying, we could say. And I think there are other pieces of this puzzle that there's a lot of people that are contributing, but if you're looking at the actual GitHub, the Kubeflow project seems to be like there are less and less contributions. But that we have been talking about, and on the thread, I'll let David get into a bit more, because Kubeflow is so many different pieces that are all kind of Frankenstein together. Now we're seeing that the contributions are being put in the different sectors of Kubeflow, the different pieces of Kubeflow.
Yeah, well, that's, those of us in this space have watched open source projects, like sort of like master of master projects like this for a long time. OpenStack is the one that immediately springs to mind, which became sort of like Frankenstein's monster of open source projects. So, what do you think, David? Is this another OpenStack, or is this the real deal?
Yeah, so for anyone listening that's not that familiar with Kubeflow, let me refresh your memory. Kubeflow is essentially an ecosystem of tools for machine learning on Kubernetes. So it's built to be native to Kubernetes, native to the cloud. And it, at the moment, is, most people think of it as one thing, but it really is actually a lot of smaller projects. Things like KF Serving, Seldon, Katib. There's a lot of Kubeflow pipelines. It's actually a lot of different things. And some of them are actually very separate. And because of that, there's been some, criticisms around the lack of cohesion as a product. What started all of this was, I'm not going to mention the person's name just out of respect for them, but they basically asked this question, if Kubeflow is not going anywhere. And they asked because they noticed that contributor activity was basically zero, right? It's like decreased drastically. So if anyone's interested, go to github.com, check out Kubeflow, and you could see in the analysis section exactly like how the trend has really decreased over time. And there was also this other interesting part where one of the I forget his name, his last name, but David, who was once leading the project, now left and is working at Microsoft. So some people asked the question, is the vision lost? Is the thing that was going to unify these things no longer there? And then a lot of people were saying that there's a lot of companies who say that they have tried it, but ended up coming to the conclusion that it makes no sense to them. And so there was a lot of interesting conversation around that, mostly by other vendors in the field that are working on products relevant to this sort of conversation. But yeah, it definitely brought up a lot of interesting questions. So hopefully it gives you an idea of what the thread was bringing up.
Let's start out with that itself. So it started with Google, as you said, by Google, to sort of try to make things easier to deploy ML models on their cloud platform. So does it mean that First of all, is it tethered to Google Cloud very closely? B, not just as cloud as a platform, but also is it tethered very close to some of the Google's tools, machine learning tools like TensorFlow and whatnot? Or can it be, is it truly, that you could use it across the platform, across the tools to use that? If not, then there's no value in it for any company.
They say, at least in the community, that it is a bit harder. It is cloud agnostic and you can use it with anything in theory, but it is not so easy in practice. And I know that I've seen in the Kubeflow community, people that are asking stuff about AWS and how do you put it up on AWS or Azure. And another friend of mine just told me that the new release, the 1.1 release, made him feel like they were going even closer to GCP and making it even easier for you to use on GCP because it has integration with config connectors from GCP. So that is some of the complaints that I've heard, some of the different things that they're saying. But in theory, it is completely open and it is you're able to use it with anything. Like it's not tied just to TensorFlow. And I think David was going to mention some stuff about how you can use the different PyCharm or PySpark, whatever you want to use on it.
Yeah, before David jumps in, let me also throw in a quirk in there. I agree with you on that. The integration connectors will make the deployment easier. But if that's all the tetherness that they have, forcing people to use it, that's actually important and useful to the people, so you could get it out faster. B, then it'll motivate other companies to build integration, whether it's AWS or Azure, which is really good. So if that's what they have, that's kind of down thing. I would say no, it's a positive thing.
You mentioned first the question of whether it can work across multiple cloud platforms, and yeah, in theory it can. At my company we use AWS at Benevolent AI. And we use Kubeflow as well. We have it deployed. Definitely has its challenges. We've dealt with that. There's a bit of a learning curve there. And we have a team dedicated to that. We have a machine learning infrastructure team that's dedicated to deploying it, maintaining it, monitoring it, and essentially building abstractions that make it easier for data scientists and engineers to build models and experiment and maintain reproducibility and all of these good MLOps practices. But it's yeah, in terms of compatibility, well, what I'm noticing is that a lot of companies, especially the ones that are contributing to it, such as Bloomberg, and I can't think of any other names right now, but they're utilizing the parts that make the most sense to them. So for example, at Bloomberg, it's mostly KF serving. And for those of you who are less familiar, it's a component of Kubeflow that allows you to deploy your model as a microservice that's serverless. So for those of you less familiar with serverless, it could scale up and scale down based on the needs or the load. And there's some really nice things about that, and it's actually made deployments a lot smoother. You can do some more involved things such as route traffic to different revisions, meaning let's say you can do some canary deployments. And if you have that system, you can basically do A/B testing with that. There's even a lot of collaboration with other tools that allow for interpretability. So you could add things like Alibi Explainer. So it's this great tool for deployment. It's open source. We use it ourselves as well. And some companies have basically contributed to that because it was in line with what they were doing. And so it made the most sense to them. But I noticed that they also don't use all components of the Kubeflow system. So I think there is some validity to the criticisms around it with respect to it just kind of not all being completely cohesive yet. And I don't know, maybe this is just me and maybe it's sort of an aside, but I don't see that as a problem. I feel like there's been the question that Steven asked in the beginning about other open source projects and it being sort of a Frankenstein. I think that, I'm optimistic about free markets. I'm optimistic about open source. I'm optimistic about the community. And I do think that over time, the best solutions will work themselves up to the top. And I like Kubeflow in particular because it's open source, and that does make a difference. The barrier to entry is a little bit easier than some of these enterprise products. And so for that reason, even though right now there's not a lot of activity, I'm still optimistic that companies still have the freedom to make their own infrastructure based off the pieces of Kubeflow if they wanted to. And that's how we're using it. That's how actually I've seen a lot of other companies use it, smaller ones. And let me not, overemphasize how awesome it is. Definitely there are some challenges. And that's part of what the problem is. And I think that what I've heard from a contributor is that there's a need for other companies to invest in Kubeflow as well. And I think this goes with a lot of open source projects. It needs backing from, teams that have mature engineering and the availability to make this what it needs to be. It won't just happen on its own, but, people have always questioned open source. It's always like that, but a lot of these projects end up, lasting. Because of the flexibility, which I think is one of the biggest benefits, but also maybe a downfall.
So Kubeflow is probably exploded in the scene a little while ago, but now it kind of dying down a little slowly or not much activity. But about 6 months, even a year ago, they were facing a lot of because it almost sounded like it was not ready for production level. And there were a lot of influx of GitHub issues, and then that people have to triage that and then assign it to appropriate SME to fix it. And then at times they were not even responding. And if you go and ask a question in their Slack forum, there was nobody responding to it. So are they really fixing it? Or is the community still coherent together? Is it going places? What's happening?
I think this speaks to the point that David was making earlier, is how these different cliques are forming, or the different subsets are forming, and they're really going hard in some directions, or there's a lot of energy being put into certain parts of Kubeflow. And then you have other parts that maybe it's not that they're forgotten about, but if you look at it as a whole and it's not the most important problem for these big companies, then it could get forgotten about. And one thing that I have pondered with David actually a bunch is, will Kubeflow become the de facto tool for MLOps? And then will everything else, every other vendor, be around that? Sort of like what you have in the Kubernetes space, how Kubernetes is the de facto open source tool there, but then you have a large ecosystem that's on top of that, and there is a lot of vendors that are doing things with Kubernetes. And so I wonder about that. David says no, I am still open. I think that we got to this point, maybe if you can get one-click deploy, but you also have so many different pieces that you would want to use in this, as David mentioned. And I think that there's a lot that is still unknown, but it's going to be a great 2 years to see what unfolds.
Well, on that point, I think that what we've seen always in open source projects is that companies are going to do what companies are going to do. I mean, I remember back in the 90s, all the tearing of hair over IBM is going to take over Linux, things like that. I mean, as soon as companies get involved with open source development, well, number one, they're going to start trying to direct it or drive it in the direction that serves their needs. Whether that's, we're going to make, Kubeflow support, AWS, or, a special, infrastructure in, this or that cloud, or, we're going to, kind of take it and build on it and have that be the foundation for our for-profit product or whatever. And then immediately also you get all this kvetching by people in the community saying, oh no, they're going to take it over, they're going to kill it. But, I think in the end of the day, what we're going to see is just sort of, well, either the development's going to happen or it's not. The community is going to develop or it's not. And frankly, that's not up to the founders of the project. That's not up to the companies. That's up to the people. And, the amount of conversation that we're seeing in the MLOps community for this suggests that maybe, maybe this thing is, maybe it does have legs.
That's a good point. There's always a lot of chat about it. Why? If it's if it's that bad and if it has no potential, why are companies building on top of it? Why are companies using it? And they are. That's the thing. There are some large companies handling large scale, and there's even companies that are meeting the limits of what you could even do with things like Kubernetes. and having to change that. This is like an ongoing issue in just software development. Like you're always going to be like, you're going to always reach a point where the tools that are out there are not enough. And so you need to develop your own layers of abstraction on top of that to make it work. And like you said, that's not really, no one company does that and can do that. It's like, lots of things that are, that are created naturally, like, like languages or money or something like that. I think maybe not exactly the same way, but what I'm trying to say is that the best solutions end up actually winning over time. That's what I think. And yeah, like if the barrier, if the entry to use some of these tools remains difficult, like for example, one of the reasons why I actually wouldn't recommend a smaller company just starting to utilize ML to use Kubeflow is because you need a team of engineers who are comfortable working on a Kubernetes stack. You need them to be able to know how to debug things in production, and that's not easy always. There's a high learning curve, or steep learning curve with respect to some of those things. So it doesn't always make sense for everybody. So if there was the ability to make it super easy, then that would even make it more attractive, and you could see from you mentioned about like kind of taking over, that one taking over them all. The reason why I'm not so convinced by that is that even Google itself, like if you read the way that they're talking about ML infrastructure and how they build it, they don't always it kind of hints at certain parts of Kubeflow, like a lot of the pipelining aspect, but they also really promote their own solutions, like the AI platform. And so that's not Kubeflow. And so it's not, even though they've had a big influence on it and it's most commonly associated with Google, it's actually not just Google anymore. It's becoming a little like I think because everyone is kind of building their own solutions around what's important to them, it's becoming a little bit of everything, and maybe that's part of the problem. So, but I don't know, with the community, I think that it is up to the community to start contributing to it. Like if I had time, I would. Okay, I definitely would. I would love to like take on some of those issues and go contribute, but I get it. You don't always have time.
I'm just going to say something a little random out of left field. I found that along this idea of how many different repos there are from the main Kubeflow project, it's not being used anymore. And I just found that there are 42 other subsets that are being active and they are being used. So the whole idea of this question that came through in the MLOps community chat or the Slack was looking at the greater GitHub repo and saying, well, it looks like the activity has gone down here, but really the other counter argument to that is, yes, it's gone down on the greater one, but if you look at these smaller ones, then you'll find where all the activity is actually buzzing still.
So then I'll ask you a direct question of sort of like a tool comparison. Even though Kubeflow has a lot of buzz in the last few months or so, when it comes to, at least personally in my mind, both the broadness of the solution set and popularity wise, Airflow has been much better, right? They are a much broader set of solutions, and they are being much popular and much better open source and integrated with the Apache toolkit and the whole nine yards. So obviously Airflow is there, and then Luigi has been pretty popular too. And then we got Argo, we got MLflow. So there are so many tools. If it is going to be, most of them are open source. And if it's going to be open source, why that many tools and people are trying to diverge, trying to create all of that? Isn't the time to merge at least few of them together to have the common functionalities? And then which one of those is going to win out? I mean, for now, I see that Airflow is a little bit popular than Kubeflow in my mind.
It's an interesting question. Like, should be moving towards, creating sort of a unified open source project. I actually think, and maybe Demetrios, correct me if I'm wrong, but I know that there are some of our friends, Pachyderm and some other companies are doing some work together to come up with what they would like, kind of their view on a unified machine learning platform. I'm not sure if it's enterprise only or if it's also open source, but if it is open source, that'd be really cool. But yeah, I do think that there is, definitely there's a large ecosystem of tools. It can be very confusing and hard to make those decisions. You have to evaluate them. I know for us at Benevolent, And I don't want to speak too much on their behalf, but I know that we really did our homework and looked at a lot of these options out there, and what fit our needs ended up being Kubeflow. You as a company have to go through that process to figure out what makes the most sense. You mentioned Airflow. I think it's great for certain tasks, basic data engineering, but for anything on the cloud, you have to do a lot of customization to make it work. It's not native to Kubernetes. And that's actually one of the things I don't like about Airflow. I run all of our workload, at least what I'm typically comfortable with, most of my workloads are running on a Kubernetes cluster. And I have to create a lot of things to make that work with Airflow. And it has a lot of problems because of that, because it's not native to that. Kubeflow, on the other hand, and let's say in particular, the orchestration tool, Kubeflow Pipelines, is native to that. So it makes it a lot easier. And under the hood, it's actually using Argo. So Argo is a great tool to check out, by the way, because it allows you to build a pipeline that's native to Kubernetes. But it really is going to depend on right now, this is a little bit aside, but me and Demetrios are really trying to think about what are machine MLOps best practices. And the reason why it's related to tooling is because good tooling in many ways is like the talking point for best practices. They encode best practices, and Kubeflow in some ways actually has a lot of good practices that I think encoded in it, but so do these other platforms. There's platforms that are devoted to just one part of that pipeline, like the deployment part. And that's a very challenging area of its own. They have feature engineering, so feature stores. That's a very challenging area of its own. And I think that it's great that we have focused efforts on that. But in my opinion, I do think that we need to start thinking about integration and the ability to build on top of these things. And yeah, I don't know how Kubernetes is like the glue in my mind for a lot of these things. And so as long as it works with that, it makes it a lot easier to scale out and to build a reliable infrastructure. Kubernetes is great for that. It's built for scale. And any tool that's not easy to work with like that is, in my mind, not going to last very long.
And I don't know if David can talk much about this, but you can also use Airflow and Kubeflow together, and there have been people that do that.
I'm using it like that, actually. So I'm using it like that. Airflow is as like an orchestrator on top of an orchestrator. Now, some people may argue that's not the best way to use it. That's a whole nother question. But yes, again, but you have to do a lot of customization. You have to build your own interfaces in between some of these things. So there's not a perfect compatibility, but because of Kubernetes, there's a way to use them in sync.
Talking about this idea of all of these different tools, it feels to me like what a lot of different vendors are doing, and especially vendors who have their open source offering, is they're trying to show the world or the Kubeflow community how they can integrate with Kubeflow and how they're starting to try and get involved in different Kubeflow projects. Because I think a lot of these different tools are starting to see that, okay, Kubeflow has a pretty wide range of adoption, and it's being put out. There's new versions of Kubeflow being put out. I think that I had a guy on, he was saying every 90 days. So you're just getting a lot of advancement. And so vendors are trying to figure out a way, how can we get involved in this? Because it feels like it is a rocket ship and it's going, and it has legs.
I have one last question. I was talking to an enterprise engineer, data engineer, or infrastructure engineer. They were trying to productionize some of the models. One thing you mentioned, which was about Kubeflow, which was interesting, was we tried to implement multiple times. We failed multiple times, yet we can't give up. We somehow feel tethered to it. Is there any truth to it, or are you just making it up?
Oh, yeah. I think that's something that is very common. And you have so many people, even on these threads where people are talking about Kubeflow, it's like, yeah, I tried that many times and I gave up. Or like you said, well, maybe they're so invested in it, they've already put so much time and effort into it that they can't give up now. And so like David was saying before, you have to have a team that knows what they're doing to stand this up. It's not the easiest. And I think that's one of the biggest downfalls that we hear about Kubeflow is to stand it up, the upkeep of it, just making sure that it works is a whole different beast than once you're inside and you're a data scientist or machine learning engineer that's creating models or serving with Kubeflow.
Boy, that really, really sounds like Kubernetes itself, what you just described. I mean, you could just substitute the words. And I think that that's, you know, so maybe that's what we need to look at, you know, the fact that, you know, Kubernetes also was a great solution, but it required so much time and so much effort and such a uphill battle to learn how to use it, that the success of it hinged on the creation of sort of, you know, plug and play derivatives. You know, first you had, you know, things like Rancher, and then you ended up with, you know, VMware baking it right into, you know, vSphere with Tanzu. And now I think that it's all but assured success. Maybe that's what happens here.
Yeah, and that's why I talked to David about this whole idea of, is it going to be the next, is it just one level of abstraction on top of Kubernetes, and you have Kubeflow, and then you have it's the de facto, right? For the MLOps space, it's Kubeflow, and then you have all of the different players in Kubeflow. I still think, David, I would love to hear you express what you told me the other day, but it feels like we're a long way away from that.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know. It's very hard for me to like predict some of these things, and maybe I just need more experience in the game, more skin in the game, to be honest. And I maybe let me also add this. Maybe this may be a bit snarky, but I also think even for people who have been involved in a space for some time, I also don't think that they're capable of predicting the future that well. It's like, this is just a moving thing, you know, and it's changing all the time. And some things are common. Like I've noticed that like this concept of pipelines is really important because it orchestrates a lot of components, and that makes it a lot easier when you experiment in an orchestrated way. But I don't know. Yeah, in terms of like, and rephrase it again, this is about, in particular, about like them taking over, or just in general, just adoption?
Yeah, more like if it was the one tool to rule them all and it was just what everyone used.
Yeah, I don't think so. It's different. It's different than something like Kubernetes. You know, Kubernetes, it was like, it's like everywhere because of it solved a particular problem, and it did it really well. So container orchestration and containers also solved a lot of those problems and helped out. I don't know if Kubeflow as an ecosystem of tools will essentially take over everything, unless each one of those is just the best at what it does. And I don't think that's the case right now. I don't think that that's the case. I think that there are some enterprise tools that are very good at what they do. And we need to recognize that. You know, it's not like we have to be afraid of saying that, you know, Kubeflow sucks at certain things. You know, it does because it's a work in progress, but that doesn't mean it's going anywhere. That's what I guess what I don't agree with is that just because it's not great and the best doesn't mean it's going to go away. And maybe that's just my over optimism, but I don't see it taking over everything. I don't see it going anywhere, and I see more people continuing to work on the components of it that make the most sense to them.
Last thing from me, I know you said that you see different kind of pieces where it's starting to congregate around some ideas like pipelines and feature stores and serving. Do you feel like those are going to be the main things? And do you have an idea of like those main things that are being congregated around?
I think the notion of, like I said, pipelines, so orchestration. I think the ability to string multiple components of a pipeline together is going to be really important. And any platform that aims to unify or like meet the needs of a stack, the complete stack needs to be able to do that. I think, I feel like containerization is like the basis of like so much of this to make it possible, because you decouple the runtime from the execution environment, and that's really important. I also see what else? The notion of a feature store being even more, it's already huge, and I definitely think it's super important. Like, I feel like that solves a lot of common problems related to the data, which is actually one of the, if not one of the biggest components of ML pipeline, is the data, what you're doing with it. The deployment part is you can kind of treat it more like traditional software, except during the monitoring stage maybe. And then maybe some other things around like how you keep it fresh in that model. How do you continuously validate that, continuously train that model? But I think that the ability to like wrap up everything from data extraction, processing, and then also down to deployment and automating that. We're going to see more of that, making it a little bit easier. But yeah, hopefully that gives you some sense of what I think. But again, this is just my limited thoughts.
Yeah, so I think that's a great summary, honestly, David. Demetrios, do you want to summarize in a moment here? Is this the real deal? Where's this heading?
Yeah, I've been thinking this for a while, and it feels to me like Kubeflow is a rocket ship, and I'm posing the question, is it going to be the de facto standard? So that's what I feel about it. I think it's a great tool. It does have a lot of growing pains right now as we're looking at it and as we're seeing it grow. But once it comes into its own, and like I said, in 2 years, I can only imagine how robust, and it's going to be much easier to use. It's only going to get easier. Right now, the early adopters are taking their chances on it, and you're creating teams that are standing up Kubeflow. But I feel like it's not that far away from some kind of one-click deployment or an easy deployment that you can get. And so once that happens, you're going to start seeing a lot more adoption, and it's going to be a lot easier. But what do I know?
Andy, any final words on Kubeflow?
Yeah, I mean, it has gone a long ways in the last at least a year in trying to help productionizing the ML models. But the one-click deployments and some of the enterprise challenges, even security, integrating with the main identity, authentication, authorization, who can see the models, who can deploy the models, and how we can control the pipeline. It's not there yet maturity-wise for enterprise. Again, this goes back to my original point about, we tried multiple times, we failed. And that's the reason why they are failing, because they are taking the model, which is built to, make ML, productionize your ML models, and then they try to fit into their enterprise model, which is where there's a lot of custom work. And if there's a way community can spend time in doing that and making it easy for enterprises, the adoption could be a lot more once big enterprises start jumping in.
Yeah, one final note I'll add to that is I also believe that the success of this will be a function of the community and other companies, enterprise, contributing to this, because it's like, yeah, that's how I feel like most of these big things work. It's a collaborative effort. It can't just be one-sided. You need, being very practical, you need money, you need funding, you need like effort into some of these things. And that's like, this is something even we do at the community level, right? Like, or volunteer effort, making like even me with something that me and Demetrios deal with. Yeah, so this is just like, I don't think it's that new. So I don't know. It's a little early in my mind to say anything definitive, but I'm optimistic.
So thank you very much, guys. Before we go, where can we find more of your writing and thinking on the topic of artificial intelligence? Let's start with David this time.
Yeah, so yeah, writing is kind of sparse, but you can be on the lookout for some more stuff. Me and Demetrios primarily encode our content and our thinking in coffee sessions. So if you're really interested in hearing me and Demetrios talk that talk, go to YouTube and check out coffee sessions for the MLOps community. Right now, we're doing a series on a paper by Google called Continuous Delivery and Automation Pipelines, and we're really discussing a lot of these things. So if you're interested, be on the lookout for that.
Great, thanks. Demetrios?
Yeah, one thing that I've started to do since the last time we chatted is take some of the great threads that have been put into Slack and immortalize them onto a blog or onto Medium. And so that's what I've been up to recently. You can check out the MLOps community Medium. And that's probably where you're going to find the most.
All right. And finally, Andy?
Yeah, you could find me on LinkedIn or on Twitter at Andy Thurai, or on my website, thefieldcto.com.
Great. And you can find me on Twitter at sfoskett, and you can find my writings at gestaltit.com. Thanks for listening to the Utilizing AI podcast. If you enjoyed this discussion, please remember to rate, subscribe, and review the show in iTunes, since that helps our visibility. And please do share this show with your friends. This podcast is brought to you by gestaltit.com, your home for IT coverage across the enterprise. For show notes and more episodes, go to utilizing-ai.com or find us on Twitter at utilizing_AI. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.